Hello everyone, and thank you for being here today. I often don't speak publicly, so you've probably never heard of me before. My name is Nock, and I'm here on behalf of Architecture and Access to talk about outdoor spaces and public areas. This is actually a topic that I'm quite passionate about because I grew up with two vision-impaired siblings. And after high school, I decided to pursue a career in interior design and architecture, and with hopes to address the design of public spaces and community spaces for people with disabilities like my siblings. And I wanted to design spaces that were both functional and inclusive. And it was during my years at uni and also in the industry, the architecture industry, that I realized that these issues aren't always at the forefront of design decisions, and sometimes not even part of the conversation at all. And that's, I guess, when I decided to switch over to Architecture and Access, become an access consultant. And I guess I found my people, and I'm really grateful for that. I'm really grateful for a career in the industry where I can actually make impact and make a difference. And yeah, at Architecture and Access, we provide consultancy services specializing in disability and accessibility for architects, project managers, local and state government bodies, and really anyone who's interested in accessibility or disability, because we really do believe that awareness, well, the more awareness people have, the more change we can collectively make to make better spaces in the future. Our team is made up of architects and designers, as well as occupational therapists. And we combine both of the knowledge and experiences from both those sectors to be able to advise, to help to educate architects in the industry to design spaces that can functionally cater for people, all people. I just wanted to briefly talk about how outdoor spaces and public areas play a really crucial role in the well-being of every community and also everyone in those communities as well. And these spaces have a multitude of purposes for all people, regardless of your age, your belief, your generation or cultural background. These spaces are spaces where we gather to socialize and collaborate with one another. And we learn from one another, we experience and share experiences with each other, and we develop as people, which is, I suppose, what we're kind of here to do today. And these spaces can really have a lasting impact on our identities. And whether you're going to the park with some friends, or you're going to a music concert, or if you're going to the G next week to watch the grand final, I think these spaces have a really critical role in the development of our health and well-being and throughout our whole lifespan. So I think these spaces and those experiences begin to shape us in some way. And I feel like I've been granted the privilege to be able to freely access and participate in these spaces and be a part of many communities. And without them, I don't know if I would be the same person I am today. Growing up with vision-impaired siblings has been such an eye-opener, because a lot of the experiences that I had definitely were not shared with them. And the spaces that inspired me and allowed me to be free are more often than not like a nightmare for them. And, you know, as I've learned, it can be a nightmare for a wide range of people with disabilities or health conditions. And although these spaces are becoming more and more accessible, I think making these spaces inclusive is another challenge in of itself. And another way to view that problem is people with disabilities are able to freely access these spaces. So they're actually able to enter the space, but they aren't able to fully participate in a lot of the activities that take place within. An example of this is our markets, which we have many of in Victoria. And it's a pretty fun place to go to on the weekends to get your groceries, to hang out with some friends, to people watch, grab a coffee, go for a browse. And even for people without disabilities, it's really quite a challenge to find where the most important things are. Like it can get really hectic, it can get really crowded, really loud, and sometimes I feel like I'm surrounded by chaos as well. So, you know, I tried to go to the market with my sister once and she had an awful time. People were tripping all over a cane, shoving her into the crowds, and things can get really uncomfortably intimate because people are just touching you all the time. And even in the midst of this chaos, I saw mums with prams struggling to get through, and people with walkers or mobility aids only really going around the perimeter of the markets where there's space. And I feel like it's such a shame that this is the experience of like more than 4 million people in our communities. It's that for such a simple task, like going to the groceries or hanging out with some friends, a task that we all want and need in our daily life. Like, it's a shame that 4 million people struggle with this every day. And it's a bigger shame, I think, because these markets are quite beautiful and they're full of life. And yeah, the unfortunate result is that a lot of people out there experience exclusions and inequalities at a suburban level. At ANA, we've been working really closely with local and state governments on existing and proposed public spaces. There's a bigger focus on ensuring the community, facilities, buildings, infrastructure, and open spaces can adequately support and accommodate disability access and inclusion. This is something I think we're really proud of to be involved in, is the upgrade of the existing libraries, aquatic centres, sports pavilions, council offices, schools, and children's centres. These are often places that bring family and friends together, and they really contribute to your health and well-being. Like, whether or not you're part of this, or whether you go to them occasionally, or you've been there throughout your lifespan. Depending on which community you're part of, you've probably seen some of these adaptations to make sure there's like ramp access for people with wheelchairs or using wheelchairs, really. And like the relevant luminance contrast for stairs for people with vision impairments. And all in all, we're really aiming to make these places more fun and ensure that everyone in the community don't just access the site, they're able to enjoy things and feel safe and participate freely, just like everybody else. Yeah, something that we've been successfully implementing in a lot of our public spaces is sensory rooms. It's a pretty hot topic at the moment. And these rooms serve several purposes for people across a broad spectrum of disabilities. And it's just really, the goal is to provide a safe space where people can retreat from all the sensory overload. I know that with my sister, often a lot of times, like if we go to the market or if we're going to a game or anything like that, just the process of getting to her seats, like she's pretty much done for, and she can barely enjoy the rest of the day after that. So having a space like this is, I think, really, really supportive for people with disabilities, and even without. These rooms are usually really calming, and they have sensory equipment, and it's controlled sensory equipment. So it's a controlled environment where they're aiming to reduce sensory overload and introduce really positive stimuli, so that you can. If you're neurodivergent, or if you're vision impaired, or if you have hearing impairments, that you can go in here and retreat and just do your own thing and find your ground, find your bearings. Sensory rooms have a lot of components that actually look really fun. You've probably seen something similar to this, like what are they? They have them at the Melbourne Botanical Gardens. It's like that light show thing that they have, and it's very much the same principles that's incorporated, but in a small space. And you'll probably notice with if you've been to them, that the experience is really calming, and you're just walking through and you're able to wander, and you're in a place where you can imagine and you can have fun and you can hang out with your friends, and it's not over the top. It's not like a concert or anything like that. And they'll have things like, it's pretty cool. They'll have bubble tubes, and they'll have bean bags, they'll have rocking chairs, they'll have what we call glowing fiber optic sets, which is like those on the seat there. So it's just like long strings, and you can just play with them, and they change in color, and it provides a textual element as well, that you're touching something that moves and that you can control. And often they consider a lot of times acoustic qualities to help control the unwanted noise, and that can be really extremely overstimulating, like in places like shopping centres or airports. So you'll probably see a rising of these. And if you see signs for them, you should probably go check them out. Like, don't disturb anybody, but like, you should go check them out. They're pretty cool. Another thing that we're really proud of, another achievement Access recently, has been the introduction of changing places facilities, rolling across Australia-wide. This has been an ongoing, it's been around for about a decade, but I guess the standards have been more and more strict and more considered. It's something we often take for granted, that people with disabilities struggle with is finding adequate amenities for their needs. And there are many stories that, can be quite confronting, and that you know, the more that I am in the access industry, I do feel like the more stories you hear, the more confronting they get. And I remember one of the stories was from one of my work colleagues. She mentioned that she had several experiences in her time before the changing places, of course, of having to place her child on a sticky bathroom floor, and like sticky, dirty, you know, unsanitary, to change her daughter who's autistic. And this story really stuck with me, I guess, mostly because the storytelling was pretty solid, and also it just stuck with me how undignified the process of going to the toilet can be for some people. And as you can imagine, nothing about putting your daughter on the floor to change her is sanitary or functional or in any way accommodating for anyone involved. And these changing places provide people with disabilities and their carers a safe and sanitary environment. And it sort of solves some of those questions, some of those issues. And they have proper change tables, they have privacy walls, showers, hoists, lifts, and all changing places are professionally assessed. So for it to be called a changing places, it goes through an assessment by a handful of people across Australia. And this ensures that they're examined and they're safe to use, and they're at the highest level that they can be maintained and last a long time for people who really, really need them. And recently the government's been providing funding and grants for a lot of these places across Australia. And I'd say that's thank you, the government. Like, this is really needed. Yeah. Sorry, just experiencing some technicals. Great. Another topic, well, the other topic I wanted to touch on was some of our events, some of the events that we've been involved in. And if you've been to Moomba or the Melbourne Show or Australian Open recently, you probably noticed that there have been improvements on how accessible and inclusive these big events have become for people with disabilities. We've partnered up with the City of Melbourne for several consecutive years to continually provide ongoing advice on how to consider the needs of everyone. And this is inclusive of children, of parents, of our aging population, of everyone, not just people with disabilities. And we want these events to be fun and exciting, and it's an integral part of our festive state. Although we have many improvements still to come with each year, we have continuously improved the access by providing, first of all, temporary plastic flooring. You've probably seen this. This has been one of our biggest requirements of these events, and it's been really successful. We noticed that although it's intended for people with mobility aids, with wheelchairs, that kind of stuff, and for people with vision impairments to be able to have that haptic sensory motion from their canes, we noticed that our primary users are actually mums with prams. And that's a win. That's a win. That's a win on more than the levels that we had supposed. And these temporary floorings have been really especially wonderful for our turbulent weather, because last year at Moomba it rained, and it rained a lot, and it rained consecutively for days. And it was substantial, and which meant the grass areas and the muddy areas were unsafe and really tough to navigate through just for regular people, you know. And it's like that. It's really tricky. It's hard to have a good time where your shoes are muddy. It's just, and you're stepping in puddles. And so people have been using this also as a wayfinding tool, because we put them to access food venues, to access toilets, to access all of the main events. And on top of this, we've also provided portable ramp systems, rentable wheelchairs, mobility buggies. No, you cannot use them if you don't have a form of disability. It's not for the joyrides. Sensory rooms, reserved seating areas, and we've boosted the amount of event staff available for assistance. One of the topics to touch on was heritage buildings. So Melbourne and Victoria, we're full of these buildings. So we have a lot of strict guidelines around whether or not we can adapt them for present use. And one of the things that you'll probably notice in a lot of these spaces is that the front entrance has a lot of stairs, and stairs are not exactly accessible for everyone. And so one of the issues, one of the best example of how people have learnt to adapt or created products to adapt to these spaces is actually, you don't see these quite often. They're really expensive, and it's to preserve the heritage of the building itself, but also adapting it to make sure that people who are using wheelchairs, whether, you don't want to put in an expensive lift, this is, I guess, one of the ways that we can resolve that problem. And really, all it does, I would show you a video, but I couldn't find one. It really just goes down to floor level and brings them back up. And this is also, I believe, a really inclusive way of not just providing a stairway that can be accessed by everyone. There's not an alternative accessible entrance around the back. You're not having to go around to access the lifts or a ramp system. This can allow everyone to use the stairs the same way, in the same space, and you're all entering through the same way. And that just makes it a lot more friendly for everyone. It's really expensive though. This is one of the other things that, we've adapted for a lot of these heritage buildings as well, or existing buildings where, you can't put in a lift, there's just insufficient space for a lift. These are stairway platform lifts. And, there are some small minor changes that you'll have to make to the handrails to be able to accommodate for one of these. And these are relatively inexpensive by comparison. They're safe, and there are guidelines around them and how tall they can be and how far they can travel. But each of these will sort of resolve some of that question about access, street access from facades of the buildings. So what is the problem? This is the billion-dollar question, and potentially multi-billion-dollar question. The problem is that as an industry, we design for a standardized user, and we design for what we perceive to be normal. And I would like to say that there is no such thing as normal. So I do think that the problem starts with awareness, in recognizing, accepting, and understanding human diversity. I think if people could be made more aware, to come to understand that not all people operate in the world the same way, I think we could at least be on the same page about something. And we can begin to have conversations around.
Are you Siggy? Do you mind just coming up?
Those conversations, we can also begin to understand the other side. And I think this is the first step to a better future.
Up there. Yeah, sure.
And as we progress from awareness, I believe that education is the next stage. And of course, educating anyone comes with the willingness to learn, and to learn about these kinds of stories and talk about them, to read about them, to investigate, and to, most importantly, reflect on our own experiences. And the changes in our environments are, often reliant on stakeholders that are in charge of planning and strategy. And the designers, the architects, the builders, the government, and we really need them to care enough, care enough about our wider community, and especially those 4.4 million people who have to live with these kinds of exclusions and inequalities every day on a day-to-day basis. And one of the issues with the built environment is that once a building is built, it often remains for decades, if not centuries. And rarely are the designs revisited unless there's a problem. And we see this a lot in my kind of work at ANA. We see a lot of spaces that have been around for 20 years, and although they met the minimum requirements and benchmarks at the time, they're just not suitable for people with disabilities today. And some of these spaces, because they've met the minimum requirements, they've left no spatial tolerance to be able to be retrofitted or refurbished if they need to be. And so that sort of restricts what you can do in order to make improvements to these spaces to make them more accessible. And during the planning and strategy stages, there's more of an emphasis on the visual outcome rather than the functionality of the spaces for people with disabilities. I mean, a lot of them often don't look nice, but they're functional. And I know this because when I was at uni and working in the industry, people really cared more about the renders and the graphic design layouts more than they did about the functionality of the brief or, you know, the theories behind how the design, you know, it often looks really plain, but it's functional. It's functional and it's not supposed to look nice. And I really think that if stakeholders could collectively prioritize inclusiveness and equality for all people, rather than what they perceive to be normal or the average Joe, I think we could have more positive experiences and be able to participate in all activities. And I guess the last two is sometimes a lot of these projects, there's limited funding and budget to make this friendlier for people with disabilities. It's often an afterthought. And lastly, of course, it's time. It's always time and budget, right? So you never have enough time. Designers just don't have enough time or not provide enough time to strategically come up with designs that can alleviate some of these issues and meet the deadline at the same time. So access and future spaces. So how can we improve our spaces in the future? And you've probably heard this probably a billion times over the course of this event, but seamlessly integrating universal design principles, providing sufficient circulation spaces and sufficient tolerances that go beyond the minimum standards to ensure public spaces are adaptable throughout its lifespan. And utilizing biophilic principles to mitigate some of those acoustic and spatial properties for people with disabilities to make them feel safe. One of the other things that I suppose, these are my additions to our current access standards. I think that providing sheltered and shaded areas, it's often in the poor weather conditions. I think if you think about rushing through from like one end of the station to the other end of the station with no cover over the top, people are manic. You know, everyone's got umbrellas and the floor is slippery and everyone needs to get from point A to B. And it can get really hectic and it can get really loud. And I think if we just provided more shaded and sheltered areas, you know, people can chill out. Like, you know, they don't have to run away under extreme conditions, or they have shading and they're not, you know, just losing their minds a bit. And I think that when you think about the sensory overload as it is, you know, without all the weather conditions going on, for someone with vision impairment, I think that it's already a difficult task to get from A to B. So when there is extreme weather, it really impairs their ability to adequately use their soundscapes, because a lot of the time they're relying on their hearing. And when that's impaired, whether it be too rainy or too windy or too loud in crowded areas, that provides another layer of issues that to navigate through. And you know, when you're providing these shaded or sheltered areas, you're slowing down the movement of people scrambling, because they don't have to scramble. You're not trying to get out of the rain. You're not trying to get out of the wind. And of course, wider footpaths, because why not? One of the other things that we've got two more things to cover. But one of the other things that I feel is often overlooked in design of urban spaces is the acoustic qualities of these spaces. And I think this information can tell you quite a lot about where people are congregating and how to design spatially so that these spaces aren't sensory overload zones for people, anyone with disabilities. And it can also tell you a lot about traffic movement and how you can design better for wayfinding. And a lot of the time there are too many things to see and too many sounds and too many smells, and this can cause a lot of stress and anxiety in everyone. And I think that acoustic qualities of space has a heavy impact on human well-being. Like in the instance of people with sensory and sensory impairments and neurodivergent disabilities, it can often relate to their overall feeling of safety. And, you know, I think if we could start to incorporate and understand how some of these soundscapes can really relate to access and relate to people with disabilities, and choose the right materials to implement in these spaces of high negative impressions. I think that this can mitigate some of those issues that people are having. We could also introduce materials and features that can take out unwanted sound stimuli or introduce positive ones, or reflective. Yeah, I think one of my experiences that I really can't stand is, when chairs move on on concrete or on tiled finishes, and it gets that screech. I think that can really be improved in all spaces, any spaces, better material choices, and, you're putting in movable chairs. Can we have some fixed seating to prevent some of these sounds from actually occurring in the environment? Wayfinding so I think this is sort of very far off in the distance. I know that we're starting to touch on it a lot more in the industry, but really organizing spaces that make sense and making sure that it's not a circuit style walkway for people with disabilities, especially when you're in transit. You just got to go to reception. You need to know where the toilets are, that you're not walking around in circles, and they have a definite way of getting to where you need to go. I think graphic design can play a really critical role in potentially life-saving information for a wide range of people with disabilities and across cultural contexts, because sometimes, people don't often, if you're from somewhere else, you might not read English, but you can read graphics and you can read icons, and some of this can really mean, life or death for some of these people, whether you can get to first aid or not. But yeah, and providing audio tactile maps and signage with graphics that are big enough for everyone. Something that I'm looking forward to with future technologies is really accessible formatting. This is something that I know a lot of people in technology are working on as well, providing electronic maps and documents for people so they actually know where they're going and they have that information beforehand. Interactive access and mobility maps, this is not something that we've been seeing a lot of, although we are pushing for a lot of these interactive access mobility maps. We do see, they're rarely, I couldn't tell you even one instance of it being introduced anywhere publicly. We have just introduced one of these at the Melbourne airport. And, I think these can be really useful for everyone. I know my siblings use them a lot when we were in Japan. And I feel that we are, as a country, lagging behind in some of those access standards. And yeah, Lucky Last is a big one. AI analysis of soundscapes. I know that this is a cross between technology and architecture, but I do see this coming in the forefront of access. Yeah. And that's it.
Thank you.
Is this a Q&A?
Yeah.
Okay, so did anyone have any questions?
Good question.
Yeah.
Do you have, is there any products such as like tactile indicators or that you think we can do better or make them sort of like aesthetic but also functional at the same time?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because tactiles are quite ugly sometimes. And I mean, realistically, what we have, you've probably seen those ones around Melbourne, right by Flinders Street on Swanston Street, where they blink red and green, I believe. So that's probably one of the better examples. But I suppose for the function that it does, you could sort of improve that for other uses as well. We just haven't seen people do it, and we don't actually know if it's possible. No, that's quite unexplored territory. But I know that when I was in Korea, they did have glow-in-the-dark LED strips that blinked, and that sat over. I mean, it wasn't the tactile itself, but it sat over the top of the tactiles. And that was quite cool to see in the streets. And, it doesn't, affect the functionality of the tactiles. It's almost an add-on that everybody can use. Yeah. Yes.
When you were showing the sensory environment picture, and then at the bottom there were like bubble tubes, and I forgot the other one's name, but can you explain kind of what they actually do and how and what ways they actually make them?
Yes. I would have to say that I am not the rocket scientist on this one, but in general, so the bubble tubes, it's actually that big tube there that's sort of sticking out vertically, and what that does is it gives a visual. So you're really centering in and looking at the bubbles inside, and that's sort of allowing you to focus your energy to just sort of zone out a bit, I suppose, and just focus on one thing and utilize your vision to just focus there. And that's, I suppose, part of the calming effect of it, is that you're eliminating all of the other stimuli. And you get really up close to these, and you're just pretty much looking at the bubbles. Like if you've ever had a fish tank and you look at your fish releasing the bubbles, or that little filter thing, and that's pretty much what it is. You're just staring at that, but it's just lit up. Yeah, and you're just like, yeah, that's kind of cool, but sometimes I can stare at that for a while. But yeah, the bubble tubes, the fiber optic sets, like I was explaining before, these are like plastic. They sort of wobble a little bit like an octopus, and they change in color depending on how you play with them. And so that's more of a haptic, like you're touching something, whereas with the bubbles, you're not really touching anything. You're just staring at it, and just I guess you are touching the glass if you get really close. There's a lot of things, like there's interactive walls, and there can be a multitude of these. There's plenty of them. There's ones where there is haptic components on there where you can touch it and it's quite tactile, and then there are projectors. So depending on, I guess, what the budget is for these kinds of spaces, you can have either or, if not both. And really what the objective of all of these items is that it provides, it's hitting all of your sensory realms, and you have the opportunity to hear things, smell things, touch things. And that's particularly important for people who are neurodivergent, where they're often prone to overstimulation. Yeah.
So would you say, kind of follow-up question,
Yeah.
that these things should, like, what kind of environments or like places do you think they're most needed to be implemented? Or
Yeah.
I think I've seen examples like on Instagram, like some restaurants usually they have these sensory stuff,
Yeah.
sensory kind of implemented, but that's part of the aesthetic.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then I guess also museum they would have these. I
Yeah.
haven't seen much actually in
Yeah.
the practical environment. So what
Yeah.
are the places that you think they should?
It's a really good question. And the short answer is these should be everywhere in public spaces. And there's, and I think what you pointed out as well is you probably haven't seen these around. And that's a good and bad thing. I think it's bad that people can't actually find these places to retreat, but they actually are around. I mean, in places, I know from the top of my head, I know we have them at Chadstone Shopping Centre. We also have some at High Point Shopping Centre as well. They are often, if you go to the directory, you'll be able to find them. We have some of these at most sports, the Grand Prix, Australian Open will have them. Any events that we have, Melbourne Show, we have them. You've probably got to ask somebody to figure out where they are, or look for like a directory or wayfinding signage to be able to find them. But I think these are particularly important in places like healthcare facilities, which I think I know that growing up, I was in and out of hospitals and healthcare facilities all the time, and we never really had any of these spaces. And even I got a bit like angst in the waiting areas when you're just waiting like 2-3 hours at a time. I think these sensory rooms, especially in healthcare facilities where, people are going in for treatments for all sorts of stuff like it, and for children, childcare facilities, I think every childcare facility needs to have one of these. I know that they have sensory play areas, which are relatively similar, but I think maybe the difference is that this one is a contained amount of people as opposed to a whole group of children. I suppose that's like the main difference. We don't have them. The airport is a new one. We've implemented a few of these at the airport. Often it's in places where you're waiting around for a really long time, even in shopping centers sometimes. And I think these are particularly useful more for parents as well. Parents with children who are neurodivergent or have sensory disabilities. I think that, you know, if you're a parent and you need to go to the groceries and, you know, your kid's having an episode, I think being able to have a place like this in a grocery store or a supermarket, for them to be able to retreat and calm down so that you can go about your day, because half the battle is really, you know, doing these activities and you're a primary carer of a child. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
So, speaking of sensory rooms, do you think it's something along similar lines with the idea of fidget toys, or do you think it's?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I think a fidget toy is, I mean, obviously, fidget toys, I believe to be part of that. So, you know, those things at the bottom there, I would consider those, you know, expanded versions of fidget toys. And fidget toys you do find in sensory rooms, and they're usually like in a box, and you can pick out, because you have like stress balls and all that kind of stuff. So fidget toys, I believe, are like a more portable version, I suppose, and it's only really hitting one sensory realm, and that's just feel like touching and feeling. Yeah.
Following up on the sensory room, is there a
Yeah,
way-
so I'm real interested in sensory rooms.
is there a way of issues on controlling the access to these rooms? Because I feel like if
Yeah.
like a normal kid would sit there and go, I don't want to play there. Like,
Yeah.
but then reserving that for those with accessible
Yeah. Yeah, I suppose in a lot of these spaces, there are some places, like, for example, at the Melbourne airport, where it's a restricted zone, and you actually need to go to an assistant, like a person, to be able to get a key to access the room, and they might give you a keypad. This is a new thing, I believe, that they've been putting in keypads where you put in the code, and that sort of limits the amount of people that can access that area. And that might be that you sign up with your card, and then they give you all the keys to all the areas. Some of these ones, like I believe at the shopping centers, they are unregulated, and I don't know whether or not they get vandalized. I haven't been around for that, but they are self-regulated, and they come with like a plaque that, you know, states sensory room, and there's sort of, it's a, hi, please be respectful of the space, and please don't do any of these things, and it's not just for everyone, and, you know, it talks a little bit about what the sensory room is for. So we hope that people follow the rules, but, you know, I haven't heard of any vandalisms on sensory rooms, so I think that's positive. Yeah, no, yeah, it comes down to education and awareness, like.
Any other questions?
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Very informative, thank you.
Awesome, thanks, guys. I guess if anyone ever has any questions, I think that my details are on this last slide. But yeah, feel free to send a message through if you have any questions, like, you know, sensory rooms. If you want to have more information, I'm obviously not the expert on that, but we can point you in the direction of resources if you need. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank
Awesome.
you so much.
Thank you so much, guys.
If you want to like stay back a bit, we will have lunch later, so
Okay.
you can grab some. And then if you guys have any questions, if you prefer like one-on-one conversations, ask questions, sometimes understand in a bigger lecture theater, it's a little
Yeah.
daunting to ask. So you can just, yeah, I'm sure that we'll be
Yeah.
happy to kind of answer your question. So
Awesome.
cool.
Thank you, everyone.
It's good.
Thank you.